All right, everybody, it's 4 o'clock and it's time for the Great War Discussion Group. We are happy this month to have Stephen Dietz, who has made a hobby and an avocation about studying optics, especially the optics of World War I. He's given a couple of things already on this, and this presentation today is about snipers and scouts. Stephen, you are on.
Very good. Thank you for joining. I hope I don't bore you too much. This one is really, you could almost, I'm sure you could write a book about it, but it's very hard to separate out topics at times. And so I tried to do this. The one topic I won't cover in optics is naval optics because it would take like 2 or 3 sessions. So the session that I use, hold on, there we go. I generally have used personally acquired documents, books, photographs, and I try to use contemporary resources because as much as anything, those provide much more of a recent to the war input of what the viewpoint was, as well as my personal both digital and hard copy archive of optics and books. So to start off with, this is not really a question, it's more of rhetorical as such. The meaning of a 3 on a match, because by the time that an individual would light the match, share it between the first, second, and third person would generally be 15 seconds. Then that flare of the match and such would give a sniper long enough to be able to put out a quick shot of the individual who might be the third one on the match. So that was the general meaning of the 3 on a match. So snipers were dependent upon both continuously looking and good optics as well. So talking about snipers, we could, I'm not going to go into the history of snipers and such because you could go into the sharpshooters of like the Burdans of the Civil War or the rifles of the British Army during the Napoleonic period. But it really, snipers as a whole didn't really come into being until the Boer War as a whole. And the Germany and Austro-Hungary had a jump on the French, British, and even the U.S. For the most part, because both countries organized a sharpshooting sections in their army. And they saw the value in long-range individual shooting skill. And so these skills were appreciated, and they provided proficiency lanyards and badges on that skill as a whole. And it's similar to the U.S. Army sharpshooting and rifleman skill, but it went beyond that. And the optics firms promoted this, such as Zeiss and Gores, for both in the private and military use. And there were military awards as well that were given by Zeiss for shooting. And Germany came to the war with the snipers having a war tool. So what you're looking at right here is an Austro-Hungarian NCO with the double pom-pom lanyard with the whistle, which really does indicate that he's an NCO, as well as the proficiency badge on his right breast that really shows that he had achieved proficiency at a higher level than just the basic lanyard for shooting. There were proficiency lanyards and badges for a number of different things in the Austro-Hungarian army, and that changed the color, and depending upon the symbol on the badge and the color of the lanyard could really indicate how proficient they were on whatever they were skilled on. So the British, on the other hand, really did not learn from the Boer War casualties. While they had the Bisley shooting matches, these were considered a gentleman's sport, and that there were long distance, but they were not really done as a whole by the army itself. Some of the British Army saw the need for snipers, but they were pretty much minority because senior staff saw a greater need for good scouting and observation than the ability to have good long-range skill in shooting. The French did not see the need at all. They felt like Elan would suffice, and they had similar shooting matches to the Bisley, but few in the military saw even a need to consider that long-range shooting skill. So consequently, when you look at the shooting, there's a thing of the original volley style, which was from the smoothbore musket to group-directed to individual fire. Now, the British training model, which I'm probably repeating to most of you know already, was a group direct fire, which was 15 rounds per minute per soldier. And when the Germans first came across the BEF in 1914, they thought they were under machine gun fire because of the rapidity of the fire. But once they went to individual shooting, it was much more like the 19th century skirmish style, which was still a rapid fire, but not taking a direct aim of the individuals out there. The French had a similar direct fire style. And it was shown in the SMLE, the Lebel, the Brassier, were all really good rifles, but there was no sniper version of these in 1914. So between 1914 and 1916, the Austro-Hungarian snipers dominated. Now, the British initial denial took it almost mid-1915 to begin an address. They considered it that unlucky shot that someone had fired from the other side. And it wasn't until 1916 there were formal sniper schools really being implemented. While they were started in 1915 and the associated weapons in 1915, it wasn't until 1916 that they really took hold. The Canadian, South Africans, and the Australian, New Zealand Army Corps were faster to respond, and they had their sniper schools in place in 1915. Now, the British model was in part based on this analogy of if you took 10 experienced soldiers, 10 soldiers with average skills, and 10 soldiers with lack of experience on shooting a rifle, and were all asked to shoot rapid, notice the word rapid, at a target 1,000 feet away, they were all going to have, after shooting 100 shots, each of them would have about the same level of accuracy in general. So that's why they didn't even see the need to have a sniper school initially. The French response was to go for technical mechanisms, such as a rifle stand or the sniper scope. And they introduced informal sniper schools in mid-1916, but it wasn't until later that they really came into their own on the sniper schools. And the Italians were worse. They didn't really have any real effort except a small investment that was mostly based on a mentor training model. Major Hesketh Pritchard is an interesting character in itself. If you ever want to see someone who is sort of a bigger-than-life individual, he was an explorer, he was a big game hunter, he was one of the leading individuals to get the sniping off the ground for the British. And one of his really detailed quotes is this one. You see, in 1915, 18 in one battalion in one day, where it's dropped to 9 casualties across 16 battalions in 3 months. That's a combination of the skill of the counter sniper as well as the recognition of what sniping can really do. So here's an example of a rifle stand. This one's using the British SMLE. And you can tell that it's a fairly simple device. We don't have one in the museum set up, or as an example, they may have one down somewhere in storage. But the way it works is that it was set to be directed and lined in on openings in barbed wire, and it was to keep the enemy alert by firing a round at these locations on an irregular but regular basis. While on the other hand, the sniper open. What you're looking at is the French version there, was notorious at being promoted by the French, but was also really bad at either shooting high or shooting low. And as you can tell, it was also not easy to either load or charge a new clip into the gun once you fired it. And once you fired the gun, you had to reline up. You could not do rapid fire because you could not recock and reload a cartridge. So it was only really good for one cartridge. So the German training model. German training for snipers was generally mentor-based, and that while they migrated to a sniper school quickly, it was still very along the lines of a mentor-teacher individual model, not groups like the Canadians and the South Africans went to. They did teach a sniper pair model, but most of the Germans were solo snipers. Now, granted, what they did, similar to the submarines of the wolf packs, there would be clustering of snipers for the Germans, but there would not necessarily be sniper pairs of an observer and a sniper. And the German schools focused more on the best shooting and hiding practice so that they would create and present the most camouflaged initially so that no one could really identify where they were. Intelligence gathering was important for them, but sniping was the primary duty, and they were chosen on their shooting skill. While the initial training model for the British was much worse, they ignored the problem or used, like I said, a technical or an economy-based mechanism, such as the sniper scope. And what happened was that skilled individuals such as Hesketh Pritchard or others would bring their own guns, and this included elephant guns, to the front to be a counter-sniping and also just to try to work as a sniper for the British because of recognizing the need. There was a recognition that there were dedicated sniper sections needed, and they implemented the schools, but like I said earlier, not until 1916. And those individuals were chosen not necessarily from their shooting skills, but were originally chosen from the scouts and observers. While yes, there were some that were chosen from the Gillies of Scotland and also some of the other areas that were up in Yorkshire to be a hired skilled hunter, but they were not necessarily chosen for their shooting skill. And it was discovered that during the training that a person might be a good sniper, but a horrible observer, and vice versa. A person might be a great observer, but not that good of a sniper. And as I spoke of earlier, Canada, South Africa, and Australia and New Zealand, their response was much better. As an example, Canada utilized the Ross rifle, which was mated to the American Warner Swayze scope early on in 1915, and it was utilized quite successfully. South Africa had subsidized snipers, a combination of a millionaire gold miner and diamond miners, subsidized and created sections and fitted all the South African snipers with 1888 Mausers, fitted in a very similar way to the German rifles. And Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs used what was available. And most of these snipers were chosen from hunter, trackers, trappers, and similar backgrounds. And that these individuals were skilled whether using across the straight sight or with a rifle scope. One thing that was interesting when I was doing my research is that the sniper training all appeared to focus on the same principles and goals. And even when they were doing the interviews, the real goal was to improve and teach. It wasn't to necessarily interact, learn. It was more of improve on the individual's observation and intelligence gathering, improve on their long distance shooting skills. Now, that's not to say that some of the individuals wouldn't come to the sniper schools with a gun that they had no idea how to use. but they would be taught in that 2 to 3 week period how to also estimate distance and wind correction. And then the different tools, such as the rifle scope, the spotting scopes, how to read maps and compasses, and then at the same time, be able to create the maps themselves and create logs, and more importantly, create good hides and camouflage to protect themselves, and also recognize what the opposing camouflage and hides would look like. And by far, one of the most important things was creating concise communication and documentation models so that they could communicate to the next person who was coming and assisting and relief to know where there was potentially another sniper or the artillery observer or whoever might be a potential target. So here was an example of a paper-based exercise, and they were shown this, and that this example did two things. If you look in the circle, it was also showing the clock logic of looking at the top, 12 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock on the left, 9 o'clock, 10, 11, and 12 on the right side. But they were also asked, do you see anything? And this was the actual test of this sheet of paper. And the individual who had very good vision would say, yes, I see something there, and that they would then be given a sort of like a magnifying glass, and what would have is what would look like a rifle scope magnified to show what it might look like at 300 yards or 100 yards. And so the 100 yards and 300 yards, if they were using a spike or a rod type reticle, is a person's head and helmet would just fill that top of that reticle. And at 100 yards, it would be about 3 times that size, so that it would almost be the chest. And that I tried to imitate it, but if what you're looking at is a hand-drawn version of that process. In the sniper environment, when they were using the different tools and such, each environment was totally different, where the trench sniper versus the mountain sniper, and counter sniping, where you were removing the opposing snipers and observers. And then finally, the defensive sniper. What's interesting is that what little I've been able to research in regards to the German snipers is that they went and migrated from an offensive sniping model to a defensive sniping model around 1916. And I think that might also have an impact on what they're trying to do as a whole of when they're trying to take out, because they were doing rear guard, and especially like when the Somme and some of the other offensives, that it was not just the machine guns and such, it was also the sniper that acted as a rear guard. So it was critically important when they were making their maps and such. And what you see is one of my free Google books, if you look up it on the right corner, is what would be shown as a line of sight for both the observation points for the scouts and the observation line of sights for the snipers. And there was an attempt always to not have the sniper have the same line of sight, but also have the potential of hitting the observation point post accidentally. Now, we all know that the gentlemen that were the soldiers of the British and Germans of that period were much smaller in build and such. And so when you see the height of this hide that is only a little more than 30 inches in height and 4.5 feet in width, you would think, oh, that's plenty of room for one person. But generally speaking, in these, there might be 2 people in there, and that the observer might be using that periscope on top, looking through it, and then the sniper would be looking through the central viewpoint. Now, absolutely critical. You notice that there's a canvas curtain at the back. It was critical that the front and the periscope would be covered before the curtain was drawn, because the flash of light of any type would potentially give away, even in low light, a potential sniper's hide. So a sniper section would generally be one sniper rifle and one NCO with 15 or 20 men per section, and usually it was less, actually. But that only of that 15 to 25 men, only 9 to 12 would be snipers, the rest would be observation. And if you notice in the intelligence section, which would include scouts and observers, the snipers would only make up about 6 of the entire section. And this I'm looking at is the British size. And when there's sniper pairs, it was more common with the Allies, except France. And it was not uncommon to have sniper pairs in Germany and Austria, but it was much more common for America, the United States, Canada, and Britain. And it would, as said, one observer, one sniper, and that some pairs would be strictly observer and snipers. Others would trade off to provide relief and capability. But critical in the sniper pair, it was intelligence gathering and to pass the details back to the other observers, because sometimes that intelligence gathering was far more important than sniping. There's a story of a sniper seeing a cat lounging on the top of a trench that he'd never seen before, and he passed the information on to the next relief sniper, and they saw the same thing, and they thought it was odd enough they passed it on to the observation, and that they did an aerial observation, and they could tell that there was a new post and dugout being built, so they bombarded it. Unfortunately, it doesn't say whether the cat survived, but it showed that the area was destroyed. On the other hand, the individual sniper, it was fairly common early, like Hesketh, Pritchard, and others before 1916, but almost all migrated to a sniper pair by 1916. And like I said, Austria, Germany, and French were far more common on the solo snipers. And they would often work, as I said, in clusters with other solo snipers, both on the relief as well as just where they were. But this also would cause a social stigma, and because they were sort of feared for what they were doing. But there was also a much higher casualty rate because of the issue of counter sniping, because one sniper, the attitude of a sniper it was that if they could knock out an artillery observation post, then they had the ability to protect their entire area from an artillery barrage. So the sniper schedule was generally the most active was the few hours of dawn and dusk, both before the sun just coming up. And this was their hunting time and called sniper's light or sniping time. And it was the most dangerous to anyone in the trenches. During the full light, a sniper would, and also the observers of the scouts would be observing and plan. And they'd only fire if the conditions were just right. At night, it would be only do night sniping against lights and light sources. And then they'd need to make sure that the hide that they had created obscured the fire of the rifle. And relief was also dependent upon whether it was solo or paired. And relief would always come at dark, but the sniper pair would sometimes be in a location much longer, but still be relieved during the night. Now, the tools, and here we're getting close to the optics and such, but I wanted to give an idea of what the snipers, it's really hard to talk about the snipers' optics without talking about what they did. And much of the scouts and the snipers' tools are identical. They would almost always have a rifle. and it was dependent upon the country, but the scout would also usually have a pistol as well. A compass was a requirement, as well as the logbook. And for snipers, they were not so much just marking their kills, but it was marking where they shot so that they would know what were potentially false hides or hides that have gone dead, or where there might be a place to watch for their relief to look for, as well as creating maps and updating their maps with markers, and then the observation optics and the shooting optics. And most importantly, their camouflage tools and hiding outfits. So let's talk about the optical tools. By far, the most important optical tool was their eyes. Now, you look at this and that their observation memory, because this is a good example of a view, and that they would be expected looking, and they would be using their scopes and such, looking for differences and changes. It doesn't mean that they were actually looking for a target. They were just looking and trying to identify the actual potential change. And obviously with our artillery barrage, whether it was creep-in box or whatever, it would change the landscape from day to day. So in Britain, the sniper might have a small 4x or 10 power small section hand scope, and that it was used by the sniper, not the observer. It was a small personal level device, and that the whole idea behind that was that they could lift it up, because most of the rifle scopes, and we'll look at them in a moment, are not more than 2 to 3 power. The Germans actually liked binoculars, and because they were solos, they would use small 6 power, and what you're looking at are older, and they're brassed, because the ones that were truly sniper binoculars would be completely covered in black and would have helped to try to keep them to not reflect any light when they were being used. But they were generally just 6 power. And they'd also use a lot, instead of the little small spotting scope, they would use a small binocular. The one on the right is a 4 power, what's called a Gore's blink. And it was also used on the heliography or the scopes, not scopes, but for light transmission transmitters. And then the one on the left is a Gore's 9 power binocular. The Americans liked to use binoculars, from what I've been able to discover, and their personal preference would be one that was also used by the U.S. Navy that would be considered a night glass, or the other would be the standard Zeiss, but with a different type of eye cap, so that they could really put their eyes up and capture as much light as possible. Once again, the British, being somewhat thrifty, didn't see the need initially to invest in rifle scopes. So what they had was what were called Galilean sights. And there was also this attitude by the British Ordnance and Armory that the iron sight of a rifle should always be ready to be used, no matter what, even if it was a sniper's rifle. And so consequently, that's why they first came up with these Galilean sights. The first one you see on the SMLE it has a peephole back on the regular sight and then a large ring. And it's kind of hard to see, but there is a dot in the center of that larger ring in front. And it's somewhat easier to see on the other one. But the other sight that you only see as pocket mount would mount to the side of the rifle. Now, these were the 3 most common British rifle scopes that were used. And what I spoke of earlier, that the British Ordnance said that the rifle had to be always able to use the iron sights, caused the rifle scope to always be offset from the rifle. Now, each one of these scopes would be mated to the rifle. It would only work with that specific rifle. And the problem is that the individual had to shoot with his left eye, or because of the way it was offset, or get into a very odd hip-hugging solution to get his eye over the rifle to look through his right eye. Now, the three types up there, one is a Doland, the other one is what's called a PPP, prismatic, periscopic, I forget what the third P is right now. And the one on the bottom is a Winchester A5. And you're going to see the Winchester A5 over and over again. And even though that there weren't a lot of A5s used by British, or they were by far the one that you would find in many of the Allied armies. In Germany, and this is something that I may have spoken of at my prior presentation, they had a wealth of different producers. And so consequently, you had the Zeiss prism style up in the upper right-hand corner. You had a Zeiss telescopic. You had a Hensoldt style. You had a Gore sight. And they were all equally useful, but the individual, they all were mated to the 1898 Mauser, and that it was the K98 was the weapon of choice. It was also many of the smaller ones, the Zeiss and the Gores and the Hensoldt, were also used on the Steyr for the Austrians, but the Austrians used interestingly enough, a carbine and not a rifle. So it was a rather odd choice, but that's what they chose for their sniping weapon. The French utilized a French scope that was strictly French, or once again, the Winchester A5. And the Americans utilized either the Winchester A5, as seen by the Marines, or the Warner Swayze. And the thing about the Warner Swayze, it was rather frightening to use if you read it, which is also why it has such a big eye cup, because it would come back and it would give, one way you'd know a sniper at times when they were first getting started, is they'd have black eyes because it would hit so hard against their face. So snipers and periscopes. Now, they were utilized by snipers and observers in their panoramic and fixed, but it should be noted they were primarily a fixed install, like I showed in the sniper hide, as seen and also utilized for quick views and quick shots. Once again, you see the sniper scope, and that's a very primitive sniper scope where the guy's looking and that it reflects up through the mirror and it is shot out. Compasses were just compasses. There were some that used the prismatic March style compass that's over on the right, but generally speaking, most snipers and scouts used a standard compass or even one that would be a lapel compass so that they could look at quickly. Now, all of the ones that were snipers were usually also, and I could not find an example, and I don't have an example, of a sniper's compass because it will be one of the few that has a radium tip, a very tiny radium tip to identify direction. The observer tools. Now, the observer tools are very similar to scouts and such. And what you saw earlier is that small handheld telescope and the small binoculars. But when looking at battery glass or battery commanders, such as the M1918 that's on the right, generally speaking, the goal was that you would see at a 10 power the soldiers in the distance. And that was what you were, a drawn version of what might be seen. The battery commander is an interesting glass because it was designed to be, in a sense, multi-purpose, to be both a periscope. It was also allowed to be used to help provide greater plasticity or a greater 3D effect for artillery and other long-range viewing. But the British loved their field telescope. The field telescope here is a 20, as high as 60 power telescope, and it would be mounted it would either be handheld, and you can see that it's a 4-section telescope. And it was invaluable to the observer to be able to identify it, because he could see what the sniper couldn't, because the sniper might only have a 3-power rifle scope or a 4 to 10 power handheld. But this allowed the observer to truly look. And if you look at the drawing in the background, you see the sniper's rifle in shadow in the back, where the observer is trying to find a potential target. And so they would also use, especially the observers in certain areas, would use rangefinders. Now, they wouldn't sit there with the Barnstraub rangefinder like this, but they would be set up in a way that they could literally figure out and provide a good, clear view of an area. Or they would use something like, once again, the Doland binoculars, which were very handy, very sturdy, and they would come in their own little box container. Now, it should be noticed that Billy Singh, who later received a knighthood, and Alvin York were some of the most decorated individuals with the best shooting capabilities, but neither used anything but iron sight. And Alvin York was obviously not a sniper. He just had a very high skill in shooting capability. But Billy Singh at Gallipoli was credited as many as 200 targets. But what happens after the war? The sniper optics and observation optics, once again, get sold for surplus. And the rifle optics get relegated to hunting again. There is an interest during the interwar period in sniping, but once again, it's not until it gets close to 1939 that sniping really takes on a new urgency. So here, once again, in the close is a French sniper, and he looks, or the periscope. Thank you very much. And do you have any questions?
I do have one, Steve. The primary benefit of a low power scope, as you point out, at this time, they really didn't have the more sophisticated stuff they have now, so that the main benefit of the scope wasn't really magnification as much as it was getting the sight picture into one optical plane. If you're trying to fire a rifle, the rear sight, you can focus on the rear sight, and then the front sight is blurred. You can focus on the front sight, and both the rear sight and the subject are blurred. If you focus on the target, you can usually also see the front sight pretty well, but the rear sight is blurred. And the skill in operating in shooting over fixed sights or over iron sights is to correct that. The whole idea of a peephole sight is to make the rear sight so small that you've got to be perfectly in line in order to see out of it at all. The big advantage of the scope is that you look through the scope and you see the target, and you see a little red dot or crosshairs that actually is in the same optical plane, so that you don't have to adjust for it. Skilled riflemen like Alvin York can do that with just iron sights, but most people have difficulty with it. And the current stuff that's available actually has little computers. You can dial in windage, you can dial in distance, so that you can actually do a much more sophisticated job for ranges further out. In the recent wars, people have done successful hits at out to basically a mile. and 1,000-yard shots have become almost commonplace. But back in these days, the sniper uh, had to use what they had, and you really can't get too much better than 1 minute of angle with, or 1 second of angle with this sort of equipment.
And it's amazing, honestly, when you look at some of the long range shots that were done. There were shots that were at 1,000 meters to 2,000 meters during the First World War, but they were the exception. They were not the rule. Most of the time, the trenches were anywhere from 40 feet to as far away as 100 yards. And so when you were looking at the 300-yard shots that they were really looking at, trying, it was usually trying to go after the second row machine gun nest or the artillery observer who might be at a high ground in a building that's just beyond the trenches.
Well, it's an interesting bit of history and an interesting technology. Any other questions or comments? Stephen, thank you very much. That was a great talk, and it's just fascinating to see how some of the stuff came together in the Great War.